political strategist Grahame Morris from Barton Deakin and Bruce Hawker from Campaigns and Communications. Bruce joining us from Perth this afternoon. Welcome to you both. I want to start with this gathering storm of criticism between Labor and the Greens that we've seen in recent days. Government Whip Joel Fitzgibbon, Union Leader Paul Howes and New South Wales Labor boss Sam Dastyari, all key figures of the New South Wales right faction of the Labor Party, have been particularly critical of the Greens, calling them extremists, likening them to One Nation, and even questioning whether Labor should be preferencing the Greens in any seats at the next election. Now, look, I don't doubt that many in Labor are very concerned about the Greens, but Bruce, the question I've got for you is, do you think this is confected in the sense that it's not so much about policy, but about politics, about the Labor Party being concerned at the encroachment of the Greens on their turf?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both, David, and I think the fact that this boil has been lanced now is part of the reason why a lot of people are coming out and making these comments that they are making. I think there have been concerns inside the Labor Party for a long time that the Greens take the moral high ground on all sorts of issues, but are never in a position to actually act on it. So, you know, they're pure, but they're impotent. And when they have got a chance to side with Labor on issues like emissions trading scheme under Kevin Rudd or the issue of offshore processing of boat people, they side with the opposition. And so I think it's a combination of those two factors.
But the Greens did help Labor form government. They do support the carbon tax. Tony Abbott does not. They do support the mining tax. Tony Abbott does not. They do support industry assistance where Tony Abbott wants to rein it in. Yes, there's a big disagreement on asylum seekers, but there's also a big disagreement between Labor and the Liberals on that issue as well. So when it comes to a preference call and who's closer on policy, clearly the Greens and Labor are closer on policy than Labor and the coalition.
I think that's right, and I think, however, the Greens know that people who generally vote for the Green Party are going to preference the Labor Party regardless of what the Greens tell them to do. Evidence from pollsters and others suggests that something like 80% of Green preferences come to the Labor Party whether or not the Greens issue a how to vote. So, you know, I think Labor does have...
preference Tony Abbott.
No, they're not. And I actually never thought that it was necessary to enter into any sort of an agreement with the Greens for that very reason. After the 2010 election, it was clear that Tony Abbott wanted to go to an early election, and I think all we had to say to Adam Banton and Bob Brown was, well, do you want another election in the seat of Melbourne, and see what happens to Adam Banton and others. So
you reckon that so-called those so-called wedding pictures of Julia Gillard and Bob Brown signing that document to form government, you think that was a mistake?
I think being seen to be too close to the Greens is a mistake, and I think it plays out badly with another part of the Labor constituency. You know, people in the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne who have traditional Labor values, who are much more concerned about workplace safety, their rights at work, creating jobs, growth, all the things that the Greens really can't deliver and won't deliver, and which Labor is committed to.
Grahame, let's bring you in here. What do you think about this row between Labor and the Greens?
Well, I think it makes it very awkward for the Prime Minister. Here we are, the underlings in our own party, saying that the Greens are dangerous fringe lunatics.
And they're not just underlings.
And their leader signed a deal with them. You know, well, on the underling thing, I find this absolutely bizarre, that this is not the Prime Minister saying this and driving this. It's not the state president or the state leader or the state executive of the Labor Party. They send out the hired help, Sam Dastyari. And you think, well, why?
But isn't it his job, and people like him, to make these sort of calls on preferences?
No. His job is to advise people at the conference to get up and argue a thing. Why would you send out the hired help on something this important?
But who makes a decision on whether they're going to preference the Greens?
The executive and the council of the Labor councils of the Labor Party. You know, it's the same with the Liberal Party. There are lots of meetings each time as to what you do with preferences, And this just seems bizarre to me as a way of a very big historical decision.
Julie Gillard has been quite critical of the Greens. In a speech earlier this year, she said they didn't share Labor's values on the work ethic and things like that. She gave a speech about where the Greens are wrong. I mean, isn't this all just part of putting a bit of distance between the two parties as the next election draws closer?
Well, so the Prime Minister says something once earlier in the year. What about the rest of the year? The rest of the year, look, they've been in their pockets, in each other's pockets. And I reckon Bruce is right. There are a whole heap of people in the Labor Party, particularly on the right wing of the Labor Party and the hard workers in the Labor Party, who are very, very uncomfortable with this alliance.
I think one of the bigger questions, though, in terms of what this will all result in is what do the Liberals do in terms of preferencing the Greens. We saw in the Victorian election campaign, Ted Bailey decided we're going to put them last, and that was seen as a masterstroke. Should that be repeated federally, and what would that mean for Adam Bant in Melbourne?
Well, Adam Bant, what would it mean for Anthony Albanese in Sydney? And there will be some very, very serious discussions as to what the Liberals do with their preferences. But what about the other way? What about the Greens? What are they going to do with their preferences? Could they, in fact, now that the Labor Party is pretending to disown them, could they, in fact, put the Liberals second in a lot of seats, in all seats? What happens in the Senate? You know, maybe it's time.
Like a stretch, but what do you think the Liberals should do? Should they preference the Greens last?
I would.
In every seat?
Yep.
And Bruce, what do you think Labor should do on that?
No, I wouldn't be putting them last. I think parties like One Nation always deserve that right, and I don't think I'd be changing the rules for that. But I do think we have to recognise that they are a serious threat to the Labor Party in certain parts of the country, particularly in the inner city. I mean, Bob Brown famously said he wasn't there to keep the bastards honest; he was there to replace them. So he treats the Labor Party as the opposition, and in a sense, they try to have it both ways. They try to be pure, but by the same token, they don't mind, sticking it into the Labor Party when it suits them. So I think, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if Labor wants to take it up to the Greens, I think that's fair enough. So. We'll wait and see how it plays out. I think it was entirely appropriate, by the way, for Sam Dastyari to be raising these issues. He's the party secretary in New South Wales, and there's a conference coming up, and he's making certain recommendations to the conference about it. And I think it's a good debate to have, because Labor isn't the Green Party. Labor is something very different. It has a commitment to growth and to jobs, which the Greens don't have, and I think we have to keep reminding ourselves and others about that all the time. But being in the middle can be good and can be bad, right? In many ways it's good because we can present ourselves as a true alternative to both the Liberals and to the Greens, but it's also a highly contested area.
Now, the Essential poll this week, I should point out, Peter Lewis unable to join us today, but there are a couple of figures I wanted to show you and get your thoughts on. Overall, the party standings haven't changed. Labor's still on track to be thumped in this week's survey from Essential. But a couple of specific questions. One on the carbon tax. We're now over a week into it, and the question was, have you noticed any increase in the cost of goods or services? Take a look at the results here. Only 31% say yes, they have. 54% say no, they haven't. Graham, I certainly haven't noticed any increased price, but 31% of people have. Most people have not. What do you read into that?
Incidentally, just on the last thing, on the Green preferences, seems to me the Labor Party has panicked, and what this is all about is trying to find somebody to share the blame with.
Now, what do you think of this survey?
Well, 1 in 3... One in three are feeling a difference and are prepared to say so. I think that's high. And surprising, and it shows the political power of this. If people are looking for the increases and they've found them and they're feeling it and they're saying to pollsters, yeah, it affects me, 1 in 3 is pretty powerful.
Have you noticed a difference yet?
Not yet.
Haven't got the power bill yet. Bruce, what do you think? 31% say yes, they have, but more than half, 54% say no.
I think 1 in 2 is a high number. Look, I actually think that that's pretty good for the government, and it does tend to point to that argument that Gillard and others have been putting, that when this thing is introduced and the sky doesn't fall in, then everything will return to normal. I don't know that that will happen, because I think a lot of attitudes have been coloured about it for various reasons since it was first mooted after the 2010 election. So I wouldn't be placing great hopes on a big turnaround there, but it is a positive sign in an otherwise pretty grim scene for the government right now.
Well, if that's a positive sign, the other one I wanted to show you isn't so positive for Labor. This is on asylum seekers. Which party do you think is most concerned about finding a fair and reasonable solution to handling asylum seekers? And have a look at the results here. Only 14% think Labor is the best party on this issue. 28% say the Liberals, 13% the Greens, and 32%, the biggest number, none of them at all. Bruce, this is pretty extraordinary. I mean, you think back 6 years or so ago, at the height of concern about the Pacific solution, Kevin Rudd winning that election in 2007 on this issue partly. Now, twice as many people think the Liberals are better to handle this issue than Labor.
That surprises me somewhat, but I guess it goes to a fear that people have about the movement of boat people into our waters. I think that's probably what that is talking about more than anything else. I mean, Labor has put forward a proposal. They've sought compromises from the opposition, and none have been forthcoming. But it's a very hard one for a government to win on, I've got to say, whilst we're still getting a movement of people across our borders into Christmas Island and elsewhere. And while that continues to happen, I don't think we're going to see any inclination by Tony Abbott to change what he's doing at the moment. He's going to get the ball on the ruck. He's just going to keep pushing and pushing. He doesn't really want to solve this issue.
I want to explore that, but just on these figures, Grahame, did you ever think it would be the coalition seen as the most compassionate, essentially, on asylum seekers?
They are in my household. Well, you think about it. We've gone from A, the coalition knowing how to stop the boats, but B, we've got an argument at the moment where the Prime Minister is essentially saying send children back to Malaysia into I don't know, be whipped or whatever it is, and the coalition saying no. And
the other interesting thing there is the Greens come out bottom of the list when it comes to
Talkback Radio.
Finding it fair.
Talkback Radio on this, the Greens got an absolute hiding from their own people.
Now, we are going to take a quick break, but I do want to continue this discussion on asylum seekers and whether Tony Abbott's Turn Back the Boats plan in particular is becoming a liability for him. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking this afternoon to Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. I want to continue on asylum seekers. Now, Tony Abbott has been copping flack for part of his policy, of course, is to turn back boats where safe to do so to Indonesia. We've seen over some time now criticism from Indonesia, from Indonesian police, from a retired Defence Force chief here, Admiral Chris Barry, and certainly from the government that this won't work. It'll endanger the lives of those asylum seekers, but also the Navy personnel as well. Now, Tony Abbott insists it worked before, it'll work again. He also points to both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard years ago offering some or indicating some support for turning back the boats. But what do you think, Grahame, really on this? Is it something that he should drop? We heard Bob Carr earlier say this is causing Australia, this isn't within Australia's interests for him to be pursuing this plan that Indonesia clearly doesn't like.
Well, let's start from the obvious. What we've got now doesn't work. And Tony Abbott is saying, look, let's try the Nauru solution, let's have the protection visas, and let's have a go at turning back some of the boats. Now, that as a package is quite a big disincentive, which would get back to all the people smugglers and many of these holding pens around the world. You know,
this particular element of it, how do you do it? I mean, this is something Tony Abbott hasn't been able to explain properly. How do you do it?
Well, it's an operational thing. You know, I heard the Prime Minister the other day saying our Navy people don't want to go to sea and don't want to do this sort of stuff. You know, I don't know what's happened to the Navy now, but, you know, under this Prime Minister, have our Navy turned into sooks? You know, this is what they do.
I don't know if there's any suggestion of that, but it's whether they need to take unnecessary risks for themselves and for those people.
No. Their job is to obey the policy of the land, and they've been fantastic at it. You know, the idea that the Navy should just parade around in those little white suits and salute to the Prime Minister is just plain silly. Their job is to get onto boats and implement the country's policy. And part of the country's policy under Tony Abbott will be to have a show of strength and a show of force, and to send some messages back to these mongrel blinking people smugglers that if you come here, you are going to be turned around, and let's see what happens.
But again, how does that fit, this tough talk about turning them around and sending them back to where they've come from? How does that fit with opposition to sending them to Malaysia?
Well, it's a completely different thing. The other is, look, we some of the cartoonists at the weekend, I thought, got it right, where people on the boats were radioing Australian Navy or phoning them Australian Navy and saying, and the Navy was saying, are you okay? And the people on the boats were saying, well, we haven't left shore yet, give us a couple of minutes. You know, these people are radioing for help, you know, almost in international, in Indonesian waters.
What I'm saying is, how does this strong stance on send them back to Indonesia, how does that fit with saying, well, we can't send them to Malaysia because we're worried about how they'd be treated there?
It fits with stopping the boats. It has been done. We know it works, and there has to be some very, very, very strong messages.
Isn't that what Malaysia's about? A strong message to stop the boats?
Now, the Malaysian one is about fairness. You know, that people can be sent back anywhere, providing they sign up and they treat people humanely. That's all.
But you're not doing that with Indonesia. You're sending them back to a country that...
We're sending them back where they came from for the Indonesian thing, but it is a very strong symbolic gesture, and people will get the message. They did last time.
Well, but that's exactly the argument that Labor runs on Malaysia.
Well,
It's a strong message, they'll get the message, sending them back to where they've come from.
No, well, there's 100 and whatever it is, 40-odd countries we can send them to instead of Malaysia.
Bruce, it is true that John Howard, under the Howard government, boats were turned back a number of times. It is true that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard have, in the past, offered support for this. Is it really something that can be outright opposed?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's made it clear that when she was given the full read on what this actually meant and the dangers inherent in this, that she changed her view about it. And I think that's the right and sensible thing to do. Look, the fact is that Tony Abbott's created this sort of image that he's going to be the Commander-in-Chief sitting back at his desk somewhere in Canberra deciding whether a boat's safe enough to be turned around or not. I mean, that's an absurd proposition.
It's up to the Commander at the scene.
Yeah, and they're going to be subject to direction from the government of the day. I just think it's a silly idea. It doesn't fit with his rhetoric about Malaysia, because Indonesia is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Refugees, and so it's all right to send them back to Indonesia, but not all right to send them to Malaysia. Why is that? Well, the answer is because under no circumstances is Tony Abbott ever going to agree to to allowing them to be processed in Malaysia, because that would overcome the problem, and he doesn't want to have the problem overcome. He wants to keep the issue there all the time. So he's never going to approve that at all.
I reckon come Christmas it will be the policy of this country, because when Kevin Rudd gets in, it'll be the first thing he does. He'll drop Malaysia and he will get his policy through, and Tony Abbott will support it. That's the sensible thing.
To that end, Bruce, I just wanted to ask you finally about the interview that Therese Rain, Kevin Rudd's wife, gave to Fairfax newspapers. It ran on the weekend. She was asked the inevitable question about Kevin Rudd returning and said she would be prepared to support him again if it was in the national good. What do you think? Was this provocative? Should we be reading anything into it?
I wouldn't read too much into it. I think what she was saying, if I can read something into it, and that is that, look, it wouldn't be just about coming back to take over the reins of government for the sake of doing that. There would have to be a very compelling, argument, and the argument would be the national interest. That's what drove him when he was Prime Minister before, and that's, continues to be, I guess, his focus. I wouldn't read too much into it. I think her words were carefully chosen, she was probably, I think, making it pretty clear that, that he would not contest another election, and that's certainly consistent with everything that he said up until now as well.
But strategically, this hasn't exactly. But it strategically hasn't been exactly in line with other Rudd backers who've been laying very low, not wanting to give any suggestion or hint that there's something going on.
Yeah, well, I think, this is Kevin Rudd's wife speaking. She's got her own perspective on these things. She was pointing out how, scarifying the whole experience was for him in losing that position, and also the challenges and the demands on him as a Prime Minister. She was talking very much from a personal view. I don't think she was adopting any tactical or strategic view about it. I think she was just talking about it from the perspective of a wife who's seen him go through some tough times.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Bruce Hawker, Grahame Morris, good to talk to you both. Thanks for that. Thanks for your company as well after the break.